Morning, everyone. I'll wait a second for people to join us, but if you are there in the meantime, say hello, and then we'll get started. So welcome to this week's Learn With Lorna. We're on week 45. This week we're looking at children in the poor relief records. If you haven't joined us before, my name's Lorna Steele and I'm the Community Engagement Officer for the Highland Archive Service. My role involves really anything that makes people aware of the collections that we hold, engages people with the collections. I tell people how they can be used and all the sorts of information that can be found in them. We have 4 archive centres in the Highland Archive Service. We have the office in Inverness, the Highland Archive Centre, Skye and Lochailsh Archive Centre in Portree, Lochaber Archive Centre in Fort William, and the Nuclear and Caithness Archives in Wick. This month, if you remember me saying earlier in the year, we're looking at doing some different themes across the year. This month, we're doing education and childhood for February. And so I wanted to look at Learn With Lorna themes that would fit into that subject. Before I go any further, a reminder for those of you who will be expecting this, that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in these events. So you can just log on either to our Facebook page or to the High Life Highland YouTube channel and watch these films. And a reminder as well that all the previous films are available on our YouTube channel. So if you want to go back and have a look at any of the other subjects, including an earlier one that I did on poor relief, then please do so. Thank you for all the comments last week. Last week we looked at online resources that could be used to further your knowledge of archival research while you're not able to get into an archive centre, certainly in the UK. So thank you for all your comments. For those of you who asked, I put the list of websites that I talked about into a comment at the beginning. You should see that when you go back into the film on Facebook. You should be able to see my list of websites that I used, but also lots of other people were suggesting websites that they've found useful. So please do go back and have a wee look at that as well. Hello to everybody saying hello from all across. I'm going to say all across the country, but I think we're probably further spread than that as well. So as I said, this month we're looking at education and childhood. And this week I wanted to talk about some of the children who have had childhoods that have been much less than idyllic. There's been a lot of interest in this subject, and I think it's something that people have a real emotional connection to poor relief records always, but particularly perhaps to the effect that those things can have on children. So sadly, of course, child poverty is not a thing of the past, but it was a thing in the past as well, and so we're going to look at that. You may remember that I looked at some stories of poor relief back in August, 6 months ago, if you can believe that. But for this one, we're going to look specifically at children who appear in those records. So I wanted to start by a reminder of some of the legislation that surrounds this subject, both in the past and in the present. So from the 1500s through to 1845, poor relief was administered by the Kirk Session and the heritors, so the landowners, quite often the same people. In 1843, there was a royal inquiry into how this system could be better administered, and that took the responsibility of administering poor relief and money and support away from the church. And the result of that royal inquiry was that 2 years later, in 1845, the Poor Law Scotland Act was passed. That created a series of parochial boards at parish level. So you remember all through these series we've talked about counties and parishes being the kind of linchpins and how you find anything in Scottish records. So these parochial boards were established at parish level and then were overseen by a central board in Edinburgh. In 1894, so just at the end of the period we'll be looking at today, parochial boards became elected parish councils. The system, just a quick reminder, was that people would put in an application for assistance. So they would have to apply to the poor relief, their local parochial board, often something that was very difficult to do, a difficult thing to have to need to do. If probably everybody locally would know that you were needing to do it. Potentially, it's a situation nobody wanted to be in. So there would be an application for help. Then there would be an assessment of their circumstances. So the parochial board or the inspector of the poor would investigate the claim, see if it was valid. They would assess whether the need was great enough for assistance and whether they were eligible to claim from the particular parish that they had approached. The minute books would then potentially hold a discussion about a case, particularly if there was any debate about which parish was eligible for paying the money. There would be a debate, or if it was particularly interesting circumstances, and then there would be a decision. And then if people were accepted, if their application was accepted for poor relief, then they would be entered onto the general register of poor for that parish. That was split into indoor relief and outdoor relief. Indoor being that the person would be admitted to the poorhouse. Outdoor relief being that they would be given some assistance while in their own home. And that might be in the form of repairs to their house, or boots, or blankets, or food, or money. So that's a kind of very quick overview of how the system worked. It was a harsh system. It was deliberately a harsh system. And that was to discourage people from applying. And that's why there's so much emphasis on proving that you're eligible to claim from a certain area. And I'll come on to that in some of these stories. So that's the legislation from the period that we're looking at, from the 1840s to the early 1900s. But just so you know, there is current legislation that also governs these records. So these records are subject to data protection laws, which means that we don't give access to poor relief records that are less than 100 years old. So currently the poor relief records are available to view up until 1921, and that's why I've chosen to look at the Victorian period, just so that we're well beyond those dates. So who were some of the children who entered into this system, and why? Well, it depends. And I think possibly a thought that you'll be familiar with. There are some children who are just born into the system. Their mother is in the poorhouse. Perhaps it was an illegitimate birth, which would mean the mother would be physically unable to work while she was having the child. And so maybe the mother would be in the poorhouse. Sometimes it's because they're from a family where poverty is almost inescapable. Some were thrown into the system by a huge kind of cataclysmic event in their lives, and we'll come on to some examples of both of those. So I wanted to start by telling you about Margaret Ann McKenzie. Margaret Ann McKenzie appears in the Kenneth Inch Children's Register. So I mentioned the General Register of the Poor. That would list all the paupers who were admitted onto the poor relief system for the parish. There was also a children's separate register, and the parish would keep a list of the children. I mean, the title is self-explanatory as I say it out loud, but of the children separate from the main general register. And so Margaret Ann McKenzie appears on the Kenneth Inch Children's Separate Register. She appears on the 6th of July 1893, and she's aged 10. These records give a huge amount of information about age, bodily health, sometimes about parents, sometimes about the reasoning for the person appearing in this system. And her condition is listed as deserted. Her general health is good. It's interesting, you'll see the different reasons as I come through this, and of course they're all, as I said at the beginning, it's not a situation anybody wants to be in. These are sad stories. But I find it particularly sad when it's a child who's been deserted. So Margaret Ann McKenzie, her parents are listed as Mary Black of Broughty Ferry, so obviously just outside Dundee, so quite far away from Kenneth Inch. But then her father is listed as A. McKenzie in Melbourne, so infinitely further than Dundee. She was boarded out to a widow, Anne McKenzie, who was a sick nurse at 8 Stevens Brae, Inverness. So that's quite a big geographical move, but she was moved to Inverness to attend training school and to be brought up with widow McKenzie. And she lasted on the poor relief register until May 1897, when her poor relief was discontinued as she was old enough to go into service, aged 14. So when we're talking about childhood and education, obviously her start has been bad enough that she's been abandoned, deserted by her parents. But we're talking about an age where at 14 she is, considered fully capable, fully grown up enough to go into service and work. And so that's also a hard thing sometimes for us to get our head around. I know many of you and many of our people's children will have had a part-time job or something in their teenage years, but to be kind of cast off from the system and given full-time work at 14 is maybe a little bit more unusual for us to think about. Okay, there's another example from Rosalis. This time, so Rosalis is just kind of over the water from us on the Black Isle. This time, the children are alone not because their parents have abandoned them. This is what their entry in the application for relief says. 9th of July, 1895. 4 siblings, Isabella Fraser, Christina Fraser, William Fraser, and James Fraser, living at Pointfield, Mains. They're aged 12, 10, 8, and 6, and they're listed as being wholly disabled by youth. So there's a section within these records that will explain for adults and children what is it that is stopping them from earning their own money. Are they in poor physical health? Are they old and infirm? Whatever it might be. And for children, it will say that they're fully or wholly disabled by being too young to earn any money. And they are in there because these 4 children are in there because they've been orphaned following the death of their father. The father had died on the 1st of June, so 6 weeks before, and he was a farm servant, and their mother had died 3 years previously. The father had lived in Rosalis for 7 years, and so the children's settlement was by parentage, which means that they were entitled to claim from that parish because their father had lived in that parish for 7 years. So just insights into how the system works and where you would go for assistance. These records are interesting for family history information. The entry for these 4 siblings states that they had 5 older siblings who are not claiming poor relief. So this is a family of 9 who've lost both their parents. There's Alexander, 23, who was working with his uncle as a grocer. Roderick, who's 21, who was working as a ploughman. Catherine, who was 19, who was at home. Barbara, 17, who was at service in Strathpeffer. And Evan, who was 15, and he was at home. And they were also admitted onto 1 and 6 a week onto the poor relief roll, and then they were struck off at the age of 15. I've mentioned, I'm sure, numerous times throughout this series that all archival research depends on the survival of records. And so you may find that the area you're looking for has lots of information or has little, or the school logbook is written by a particularly voluble school teacher or by one who just writes one sentence. It's a constant thing that we come across, that it depends what's survived and who's written it and how. And this can really clearly be seen in poor relief records. So for instance, for some parishes like Farr and Edrahillis in Sutherland, Applecross and Ross and Cromarty, we have excellent coverage, really good comprehensive applications for relief, general registers, minute books, children's separate registers, assessment rolls, cash books, all sorts of things. But for others, they're much more sparse. And I was struck with this again yesterday. For about the 4th time, I think, 5th time in the last year, I was able to actually go into my office at work as opposed to my office at home and have a look through some of the collections to take some notes for this. And it was really interesting looking at the huge range of some parishes and the much smaller ones. So sometimes you're piecing together bits of stories. But the other thing I found when I was looking through them yesterday were some interesting geographical variations in the surviving children's registers. Some that I can see a logical reason for and some that I can't. So I thought I'll just highlight it and see what you think. I looked at the parish of Cromarty, and the pages of the children's separate register for Cromarty contain pages of orphans, one after the other, orphans. And initially I thought, I wonder if that's because it's a coastal fishing community. I know I've spoken before that sometimes coastal communities have a very hard life. So I wondered if it was because it was fishing communities that there was a lot of missing parents. But then I went to look at Edrehillis parish, which is on the west coast of Sutherland, and found very few orphans at all. But what I found there was many children who were appearing on the Poor Relief Register but were still living with both their parents or one of their parents, and it was just that the whole family was so destitute that they just couldn't afford to bring up these children. So some interesting variations there to have a think about as well. But I wanted to pull some examples from Cromarty to tell you. And the first one was Alexander McKenzie. In 1881, he was 8 years old. He's recorded as being separated from his parents, and it says that he is an illegitimate child. It says that his mother is the wife of Donald Sutherland, Screech, but the reputed father is Alexander McKenzie of Lade. So, born illegitimate and separated from his parents for that reason. Again, so many of these stories, of course, by their nature, are very sad, but one thing that I thought was a small, nice thing about this story was that it notes that although he is partially destitute, that he lives with his grandaunt, Margaret McKenzie, in Lade, Gairloch, and she wanted it noted that it would be a true hardship if she ever had to be parted with him, which I thought was particularly nice. And so he gets outdoor relief. His grandaunt is given some money to support him, and he stayed on the roll again until he came of age. And he's listed throughout as being in very good health. So there's a feeling there of, the great aunt wanted to look after him. She just wasn't able to do as much as she wanted to. And so the system supported her to do that. It's a good example of what I've already mentioned, that kind of constant debate around who is responsible for each pauper, because he lives in Gairloch, his mother lives in Cawdor, but they're claiming from Cromarty because that's where the parents got married. So you can imagine, I didn't check what the complete survival of each of those areas was in our records, but if you looked through them, you would find discussion about who is responsible for this child. Another example from Cromarty was a wee boy called John Chisholm. And in 1866, when he appears, he's 8 years old as well. And it says that he was separated from his parents by necessity because he required to attend the deaf and dumb institution in Edinburgh. It says that his father's location is not known. His mother is Mary Ann Garvey or Chisholm, and she's in the Black Isle Combination Poorhouse. So this is just something, I'm trying to pull different examples just to have a think about the reasons people go in. So he had to go in because the family were unable to look after him, because he was deaf and dumb and they couldn't educate him as well as they wanted to, but also the mother was in the poorhouse and the father is unknown. So sometimes you see children who, they just didn't get a fair start at life. So on the 22nd of November 1873, so about 7 years later, these volumes record, that he was removed to Cromarty and he was apprenticed to Robert Mackay, tailor, at 5 shillings a week. And I love this. Sometimes when you see the people who have gone away to be educated at a blind institute or a deaf and dumb institute, then they're being given specialist training by people who understand their condition, and then they come home to be apprenticed to somebody. And so he remains on the roll quite unusually until he's 21, 1879, so quite old. But it would suggest that he had been able to carry on his apprenticeship. And there's another similar one actually that talks about another child who had gone and again trained actually apprentice as a tailor, and it said that he was struck off the roll early because he was able to be self-supporting, which is a positive outcome for a sad start. And as an aside, I thought it was particularly interesting in the Cromarty one that I didn't come across in the others was the appearance and use of the tea names. I know I've spoken a bit about tea names in the past. They're kind of like nicknames used to differentiate a lot of people who might have the same name, particularly in fishing communities. And so I found in this volume Screech, who I mentioned before, but also Lugs is there. And he's the father of another boy who went to the deaf, dumb and blind institute to be educated and trained. Before I go any further, a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this. But if you're able to donate towards our work, we would be incredibly grateful. There's a link to be able to do so in the Facebook comment, in the text of the Facebook post, and also you can do so on our website. So we'd be very, very grateful, and thank you to those of you who have already done so. It really is appreciated. Now, as I said, of course, by the nature of these stories, they are incredibly sad. I wanted to tell you the story of Benjamin Finlayson, who appears in the records for 1880. And again, he's blind. And he's sent to the Institution for Education for the Blind in Inverness. The parochial board system gave him £10 a year to support his training and education in the Blind Institute. But then in 1899, he's admitted to the Blind Asylum. And then later throughout his life, he's listed as a boarded out lunatic. Then he says he's back living with his father. And then his final entry states that he's in the poorhouse. And you get a sense of someone who didn't stand much of a chance with one thing and another in his life. I'm going to round off by telling you two final stories of two families. One in the north of Sutherland and one in Inverness. And I'm seeing some people asking about the Inverness records, so I'll come on and tell you a story that can be found in the Inverness records. So I'm starting with a family in Farr in Sutherland. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that there's great records for the parish of Farr. So this is right up on the northwest coast of Sutherland, right on the top end of the mainland of Scotland. On the 17th of November 1868, Anne Campbell and Angus Campbell appear in the poor relief registers. They're aged 11 and 4.5 respectively. It records that Angus, the 4.5-year-old, is of very good health, but it says that Anne is not robust. So although she's 11, she's unable to really do much because she's not strong enough. What I found interesting about this story is these two children have been entered into the poor relief system because their father has been confined in Perth prison. And he's been put into Perth prison for the murder of his wife in a fit of insanity. Since that had happened in June of 1868, they had been taken in by their uncle, William Campbell, who was a shepherd at Invershin. But as he already had 4 children of his own, he's happy to take care of them, look after them, but he's gone, again, much like the aunt in the other story, saying, I'm happy to do this, but I need support and to be able to do it. So I took these kind of hints that I found in this story and went onto the National Records of Scotland website. And again, if you were watching last week, you'll know I spoke a little bit about the National Records of Scotland catalogues being online. And it's another example of how I can use our records to find a story and then look in other organisations, institutions to find, or just other collections to find a rounder story. And so I had a look at the NRS catalogues, and it shows that they hold these 3 things. A precognition against Kenneth Campbell, shepherd, for murdering his wife Margaret in Littermore, Tongue, Sutherland, on the 20th of June, 1868. Now, without having done their family tree, I can't promise you 100% this is the same people, but my very, very strong suspicion is it would be incredibly unlikely for 2 Kenneth Campbells, who were both shepherds, to both murder their wives in the north of Sutherland in the same month of the same year. So I'm just putting that out as a disclaimer, but I'm pretty sure it's the same people. So a precognition against him for the murder. There's also, in the National Records of Scotland, an architectural plan and elevation of the house where the murder happened. So for some reason, they've had to get someone to go and draw an architectural plan of the house that's been relevant in the trial. They also hold the trial papers from July 1868 at the High Court of Justiciary. Kenneth was found not guilty on the grounds of insanity, and he was instructed to be released because they felt that he should be considered not guilty because he had been, I guess, maybe what, I'm not a lawyer, but maybe what we would now call grounds of diminished responsibility. So it's just, it's interesting. There's, some of the reasons that people end up in these kind of systems. And there's an interesting discussion in the minutes about that case because, again, which parish should be responsible depending on where they live, depending on where they were brought up, things like that. And the final story that I wanted to tell you was the story of the Dunbar children. And this happened in Inverness, again, as I think my colleague Jennifer has probably replied. Yes, great records for Inverness borough itself, lots of poor relief records. So on the 28th of May 1884, a claim appears in the applications for relief by William Dunbar. He is living in 18 Argyle Street in Inverness, and he claims for his 5 children. His children are Jane, aged 8, Augustus, aged 6.5, Andrew, aged 5, Donald, aged 2.5, and Alexander, aged 8.5 months. William Dunbar is recorded as a plumber and a widower, aged 49, and it records the family as partially homeless. On the side, there's a column for additional notes, and this column, in this instance, says that his wife, Grace Mackay, died 8 months ago. William asks the parochial board if they will allow his children to be admitted into the poorhouse. He says he only wants them to go in for 7 to 10 days and that he'll pay 5 shillings a week for each child towards their upkeep. So you just get the sense of someone who is recently bereaved, unable to cope with 5 children under the age of 8, and of course probably trying to earn a living, trying to support them and not able to look after them. And that's a huge range. As anyone who's currently homeschooling will know, from 8 to 8.5 months will be a huge range of children to be looking after, particularly while coping with his own grief. So they were admitted into the poorhouse. The parochial board was happy for this to happen. I'm seeing your comment, Fiona. Actually, she didn't die in childbirth, but I don't know if it was something that was connected to it, but she died, if I remember correctly, about 20 days or so after the child was born, the youngest child. So it will have been, I think, connected to it, but I'm not entirely sure. So these children were admitted into the poorhouse. The parochial board said that they would be happy to take them in. But an interesting aside on that case notes that they felt that the case should be transmitted to the law agents to take whatever proceedings against the father that they saw fit. So that kind of leaves you wondering. So then I moved to the poorhouse admissions register, and you can see these 5 children coming into the poorhouse. It's just touching and sad to see that they are all listed as being very dirty, which is sad. The other sad thing is he requested for them to go in between 7 to 10 days, but you see that they are all in for at least 2 years in the poorhouse. When we go to the children's separate register, we find out a bit more information, and it says there that the father was addicted to strong drink and had been turned out of his house. Because of that, he'd become unable to support his children. After leaving the poorhouse after a couple of years, Jane, the oldest child, went back to her father. I find that interesting because she's the only girl and she's the one that went back, so I don't know if that was to support and assist him. I don't know. And then the other children were all boarded out. And what's interesting from what we're able to do with our collections is we were able to confirm that story in the relevant poor relief records, in the relevant education records, sorry. So you can see where a child is boarded out to and then double check that in those education records, and it confirms that they were boarded out. And they were boarded out to a crofter in Arbreachan. What I find nice about that in this kind of horrible, tragic story is that they were still there some years later. And obviously the lady who was looking after them also had various other boarders from different families. So she obviously had that was something she did, was took in children from the poor relief system and looked after them. So that's the Dunbar's story. I know to some extent these are not full and rounded stories because they're a glimpse into a life, from a statistical and admin point of view, really. It'll record when they went in, why they went in, and then how their case was disposed of. So you don't get a full story of that person's life or a full view into what their surroundings were. But what I really wanted to get across, and I hope I've been able to, is two things. One is I hope I've told these stories with the compassion that they deserve. They are, they're real people, and they're people who didn't get a good start. And I think that is not a reason that we should not remember them and cherish their lives and talk about them. But I also hope that these stories have shown the range of reasons that people can find themselves in a system like this. Sometimes people are just born into long-term desperate poverty that it is incredibly hard to lift yourself out of. Some come through illness, through disability, through lack of work in the area they live in, and some come through a massive crisis in their family life, like the Dunbars with the bereavement, or the family who had the murder, in a huge upheaval in a family that can suddenly throw people into a difficult and tragic situation. It doesn't take much, and I believe it still doesn't take much to push people from surviving into a desperate situation. So I hope you've enjoyed it, is the wrong word, but I hope you've found it interesting and useful, and I hope that at some point when our buildings reopen, you're able to come back in and have a look at these fantastic records. I hope you can join me next week. Next week I'm looking at stories from the school logbooks, so these will not be as tragic. There are some sad things to be found in school logbooks, but also some excellent ones, including the teacher who said, we're giving up singing in this school for the foreseeable future because there are only 3 pupils and they're all terrible. So there can be some fun things in school logbooks. So I hope you can join me next week. And a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer, that High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in these. But if you're able to donate, we really appreciate that. I'll speak to you next week. Thank you.